Secretary of Defense mocked her at the table until the female soldier said calmly, "She's with me." The hall was filled with laughter, the kind that hides discomfort behind polished glasses and glittering chandeliers. At the head of the table sat the Secretary of Defense, his authority unquestioned, his arrogance unchecked. In front of him, a woman trembled under the weight of his words, humiliated in a room where no one dared to intervene. Every cruel remark deepened her silence, and the audience obeyed the performance, clapping and smiling as though dignity itself could be erased by his power. But in the shadows stood someone different, a young female soldier, quiet, steady, unnoticed. She didn't raise her voice, nor did she rush to the table. Yet her presence alone unsettled the atmosphere. And when the moment came, when arrogance reached its peak, she stepped forward with 3 words that froze the room and shattered the illusion of control. "She's with me." This is a story of how silence defeated arrogance, how dignity was restored by the calm strength of a soldier underestimated by everyone, except herself. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, subscribe now, give this video a like, and leave your comment below. The banquet hall glowed under chandeliers that seemed to mock the faces gathered below. Crystal glasses chimed with each toast, and silver trays carried dishes no soldier in the field would ever see. At the head table, the Secretary of Defense leaned back in his chair, his voice dripping with authority, as if the entire room were his personal stage. Around him sat generals, politicians, and wealthy donors, all eager to laugh at his jokes, no matter how cruel. His gaze eventually settled on a woman, seated a few chairs away, her presence oddly out of place among the tailored suits and jewel gowns. He smirked, already preparing the words that would reduce her dignity in front of them all. The hall hushed, waiting. Would he offer respect, or deliver the humiliation everyone anticipated? The secretary's lips curled into a sneer as he raised his glass. "Some of us," he said, voice carrying with deliberate sharpness, "earned our seats here. Others were simply lucky enough to be invited." The jab was thinly veiled, aimed directly at the woman whose hands trembled as she reached for her water. A ripple of nervous laughter followed, not because the joke was funny, but because power demanded an audience. The woman lowered her eyes, her silence confirming her vulnerability. No one came to her defense. Not yet. The secretary savored the discomfort, mistaking it for control, unaware that the room was quietly shifting beneath him. What gave him power tonight might be stripped away in an instant. Across the hall, unnoticed at first, a young female soldier stood near the wall, dressed plainly compared to the opulence surrounding her. She had no medals glinting under the lights, no rank proudly displayed, just a quiet posture of someone who belonged but was never meant to be acknowledged. Her eyes tracked every word, every gesture, her jaw tightening when the insult struck its target. She did not move, not yet, but something in her stillness unsettled those who glanced her way. A question hung in the air. Was she merely an observer, or was she waiting for the right moment to act? The secretary leaned forward, pressing his advantage. "Tell me," he said to the woman, "do you know what discipline looks like? What sacrifice feels like? Or do you only play at belonging where real duty is required?" Gasps rippled faintly through the hall. It was no longer a joke. It was a deliberate cut. The woman's throat tightened. Words died before they could form. Her humiliation was complete, or so it seemed. The secretary leaned back again, satisfied, as though he had crushed a bug beneath his heel. Yet in the corner of his vision, he noticed a soldier. Her eyes did not flinch. Her silence was not weakness. It was a warning. The woman at the table shifted uncomfortably, every fiber of her body screaming to leave, but her feet remained rooted. She felt trapped under the gaze of dozens, the cruel laughter digging deeper into her chest than any blade. The secretary's dominance seemed absolute, and yet something in the air thickened. The soldier's stare was no longer passive. It was calculating, deliberate. If anyone had been paying attention, they would have seen it. The moment when silence transformed from submission into the calm before a storm. The clinking of glasses and murmurs of approval tried to drown out the unease, but the tension refused to vanish. Even those loyal to the secretary shifted in their seats, sensing the imbalance. The room wanted entertainment, not cruelty, but no one dared intervene. Their cowardice was his shield. Still, in that fragile shield, cracks were forming. The soldier's presence was like a shadow stretched across the table, unnoticed yet unavoidable. The secretary had no idea that the very stage he controlled was being prepared for his undoing. A final insult slipped from his lips, quieter but sharper, like a knife meant only for the woman to hear. "You don't belong here, and you never will." The woman's eyes stung with tears she fought to hold back. The secretary believed his victory complete. He raised his glass again, but the gesture felt hollow, the laughter slower to follow. A subtle shift was taking place. The room no longer laughed with him, but out of habit, out of fear. He had crossed an invisible line, and the weight of it lingered. For the first time that evening, silence carried more power than his voice. In the midst of that silence, the soldier near the wall exhaled slowly, her decision forming like steel in her chest. She had watched long enough. The arrogance at the table had written its own downfall. Soon, the secretary would learn that true authority doesn't always shout. It can whisper and command more fear than thunder. The question was no longer if she would act, but when. The hall held its breath, teetering on the edge of a moment that would change everything. The secretary basked in his own arrogance, sipping wine as if humiliation were a delicacy only he could afford. His allies leaned closer, their forced laughter filling the hall like smoke, choking those who wanted to breathe but dared not. At the far end of the room, the female soldier remained a silent observer, her figure half hidden by the heavy velvet curtains. She looked almost ordinary, yet her stillness carried weight. No one knew her name. No one cared. Yet the irony was cruel. The very person dismissed as irrelevant held the calm that would soon shatter the balance of power. The only question was how much more she would allow before stepping out of the shadows. The woman humiliated at the table twisted her napkin under the cloth, fighting the urge to disappear. Every cruel word replayed in her mind, each echo louder than the last. She glanced once toward the soldier, unsure why her eyes were drawn to that corner. There was no reason to expect help from a stranger in uniform, but the steadiness in those eyes offered something she hadn't felt all night: hope. She clung to that fleeting connection as though it were a rope thrown across a chasm, not knowing if it would hold, but desperate enough to reach anyway. The secretary raised his voice again, this time addressing the entire hall. "Discipline," he declared, "is not for the weak. It is for those who understand loyalty, order, and strength." His words boomed like an anthem, but instead of admiration, they carried a subtle unease. Guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure if they were applauding authority or cruelty. The soldier's eyes never left him. She watched not just what he said, but how he fed on fear. To her, this was not strength. It was rot disguised as command. How long could he carry this performance before someone called his bluff? A general seated nearby forced a laugh that broke too quickly, like glass shattering. Others followed, nervous, eager to please a man who could end careers with a single order. Yet the energy in the room faltered. The humiliated woman's silence screamed louder than their laughter. The soldier noted it with precision. Humiliation had reached its peak. Any further insult would backfire, and she knew the secretary's arrogance would not stop here. She was already counting his mistakes, each one a stone in the wall he was building around himself. The moment he sealed it, she would strike. The soldier shifted slightly, enough for a sliver of light to catch the edge of her profile. A few at nearby tables noticed her then, puzzled. Was she merely security? A decoration of discipline at a political feast? Their whispers died quickly under the secretary's gaze, but the image of her lingered. For the first time, she was no longer invisible. The spell of arrogance that had silenced the hall was beginning to weaken. One spark and it would collapse. And in that silence, people began to wonder, who was she really? The secretary, drunk on his own performance, leaned back again. His smirk widened, convinced the evening belonged entirely to him. Yet the soldier's presence grew heavier, invisible threads pulling attention toward her even as she stayed motionless. The woman at the table sensed it most sharply. It was as if she could already hear the words unspoken, words that might defend her when no one else would. Her breath steadied. She no longer felt entirely alone. That shift, subtle but powerful, was the beginning of the secretary's undoing. The soldier's hand brushed against the back of the chair beside her, grounding herself. She knew timing was everything. To move too early would squander the impact. Too late, and the woman's spirit would break completely. She could feel the room teetering, as though all the chandeliers above them trembled on thin wires. The secretary thought he held absolute control, but control is fragile when built on mockery. The soldier's patience was not weakness, it was strategy. And soon, the arrogance of one man would collide with the resolve of another presence entirely. Then came the pause, the quiet before the storm. The secretary lifted his glass again, preparing another blow, the kind that would leave scars long after the night ended. But this time, the hall seemed less willing to cheer. Their applause faltered, their eyes uncertain. The soldier leaned forward, her stance shifting just enough to betray her readiness. The moment of intervention was approaching, inevitable as the swing of a pendulum. The secretary had no idea that his stage was about to become hers. The secretary rose slightly from his chair, his fist pressing against the table as if the oak itself owed him obedience. "This hall," he declared, "stands on loyalty and respect, and those who cannot command either should not be here." His words echoed like a gavel striking. Yet instead of admiration, unease spread across the room. Glasses still Madeira. Guests glanced at one another. Unwilling to laugh this time, the woman he had targeted shrank into herself, trembling under the invisible spotlight he cast upon her. The atmosphere was heavy, ripe for collapse. Then the soldier shifted, stepping forward, breaking the illusion that she was merely a shadow. The sound of her boots against the polished floor cut sharper than any insult. Each step silenced whispers, until the hall seemed to breathe as one. She did not rush, nor did she flinch under the scrutiny of hundreds of eyes. The secretary's brow furrowed, irritation flickering into confusion. Who gave her permission to move? Yet her calm was unnerving. She reached the edge of the table, her presence alone rearranging the hierarchy that the secretary believed unshakable. For the first time, he was not the one commanding the silence. It belonged to her. The woman, humiliated moments earlier, raised her eyes, catching sight of the soldier at her side. Relief flooded her expression, as if a lifeline had materialized where there had only been despair. Around them, the guests leaned forward, unsure whether to expect chaos or spectacle. The secretary straightened in his chair, his jaw tightening. "You're out of line," he snapped, voice cutting across the hall. But the soldier didn't react with the defensiveness he expected. Instead, she met his glare with a steady calm, the kind that erodes arrogance more effectively than fury ever could. She drew a single breath, and when she spoke, her voice was not raised. It was measured, deliberate, unyielding. "She's with me?" The words were simple, yet they thundered through the hall, louder than any speech. Chairs shifted, jaws dropped, and the silence thickened into something electric. The secretary blinked, taken aback by the audacity, though the words were delivered like a whisper. It wasn't volume that carried power, it was conviction. And in that moment, the entire balance of the evening shifted. Who was this soldier who dared to stand against him? For a heartbeat, no one moved. The secretary's allies waited for his laughter, for his dismissal of her words. But nothing came. The soldier's calmness had stolen even his ability to mock. The woman at the table exhaled shakily, tears glistening, but now mixed with something new, gratitude. Guests murmured in confusion, not daring to speak too loudly. They had never seen the secretary challenged in such a way, and the challenge had not come from a rival of equal rank, but from someone dismissed as irrelevant. That paradox was its own weapon. The secretary tried to summon his authority, slamming his palm against the table. "Do you know who I am?" he barked, but the outburst rang hollow. His question revealed more than he intended. Fear. The soldier didn't flinch. Her gaze held him in place, not aggressive, but immovable, as though she carried the weight of 1,000 voices silenced before her. The hall felt it too, the sense that her words did not belong to her alone, but to something larger, something undeniable. The secretary was no longer mocking her. He was defending himself. Around the room, loyalties shifted subtly but unmistakably. A general's eyes narrowed, no longer amused. A donor set his glass down, suddenly uninterested in cheering the secretary's arrogance. The laughter that had once filled the air was replaced by an oppressive silence, every second stretching thinner, sharper. The soldier's words still lingered, echoing like a verdict that could not be overturned. The secretary realized too late that he had been cornered not by force, but by dignity. His stage was slipping, and the soldier had not yet revealed her full hand. The soldier remained still, her declaration hanging in the air like a command no one dared disobey. She had said only 3 words, but those words had redrawn the lines of power in the room. The secretary rattled, searched for control, but every eye was now on her, not him. The hall itself seemed to lean toward her, waiting for what would come next. And she knew this was only the beginning. The secretary's fall had started, and there would be no turning back. The hall remained frozen in the aftermath of her words. "She's with me?" They rang like a verdict, reshaping every face in the room. The Secretary of Defense, accustomed to obedience, found himself staring at a soldier whose calmness was more commanding than his thunder. For the first time that evening, the silence did not belong to him. It belonged to her. His fingers twitched against the rim of his glass, but he did not lift it. Even his movements betrayed hesitation. Guests whispered nervously, each glance passing like sparks, asking the same unspoken question. Who was this soldier? The woman who had been humiliated sat straighter, her shame dissolving under the shield of those words. Her trembling hand steadied, her chin lifted. She had no idea why the soldier had chosen to defend her, but in that defense, she felt seen, valued, in a way the secretary's cruelty had tried to erase. Her eyes shone with gratitude, but also disbelief. Could dignity really be restored with such simple defiance? The crowd was just as unsettled. They had witnessed challenges before, but never one this subtle, this devastating. The secretary forced a smile, though it cracked at the edges. "Brave words," he said, his tone sharp but faltering. "But do you understand the weight of the man you oppose?" His voice carried, but it lacked conviction. The soldier didn't answer immediately. She let the silence stretch until his authority withered inside it. Then, with steady eyes, she replied, "I understand enough." The words struck harder than any accusation. Gasps rippled through the hall. He had shouted, but she had whispered, and yet it was her voice that carved deeper. The tension climbed higher as the secretary leaned forward, desperation creeping into his expression. He gestured broadly, as if trying to reclaim the stage through sheer movement. This is absurd. A soldier challenging the highest office of defense. His laughter was brittle, clinging to authority that was no longer his. Yet the guests did not laugh with him. Their silence betrayed their shifting allegiance. In that silence, the soldier's authority grew, unseen but undeniable. The secretary felt the shift, and it rattled him more than open rebellion ever could. Eyes darted across the room, from generals to donors, from aides to politicians. Each was recalculating loyalty in real time. The soldier hadn't just spoken for the humiliated woman. She had spoken for them too, whether they admitted it or not. Her defiance revealed something they had all buried, the fear of his power. And fear, once named, begins to lose its grip. The secretary saw in their eyes the subtle betrayal of those who would no longer laugh when commanded. He had built his empire on obedience, and now obedience cracked like thin ice beneath his feet. The humiliated woman whispered, barely audible, "Thank you." But the soldier did not break her gaze from the secretary. Her focus was absolute, unflinching, as if the rest of the hall had vanished. In that duel of silence, the secretary faltered again. He tried to rise, to tower over her, but his authority seemed smaller than the ground she stood on. For every inch he gained in posture, he lost in dignity. His own shadow betrayed him, stretching weakly under the glow of chandeliers. Power, once absolute, was now a performance that convinced no one. The soldier finally spoke again, softened before but heavier than stone. Respect cannot be commanded by fear. The words struck the heart of the hall, piercing the fragile facade the secretary clung to. Guests murmured, emboldened by the truth they all recognized but never dared voice. The secretary's jaw clenched, fury simmering beneath his skin, but no words came. For every second he stayed silent, her authority expanded. It was as if she had taken the very weapon he wielded, silence, and turned it against him. The atmosphere shifted entirely. What had begun as a dinner under his command had become her courtroom. Every eye now rested on her, awaiting her next move. The secretary realized, with a dread he could not mask, that the room no longer saw him as unshakable. They saw him as a man cornered, unraveling under the calm gaze of a soldier he had dismissed as insignificant. The hall held its breath, waiting for the final strike that would break him completely. The secretary's composure cracked. His hand slammed against the table, rattling silverware, but instead of commanding fear, the gesture drew startled gasps. "Enough of this farce," he roared, though the roar lacked its former strength. Guests exchanged wary glances, their silence growing heavier, more dangerous than any protest. The soldier stood unflinching, her calm a mirror reflecting his weakness back at him. His power, once absolute, now felt desperate, like a candle fighting against the wind. For the first time, the mighty Secretary of Defense looked cornered, and everyone could see it. He tried to regain control with words, but they faltered. "This soldier," he scoffed, "does not understand the burden I carry. Do you know the decisions I make? The lives I control?" His attempt at grandeur sounded hollow, echoing off walls that no longer carried his authority. The soldier stepped closer, her boots striking the floor with deliberate calm. She didn't need a speech. She carried in her silence a force his titles could not rival. And as she approached, the audience leaned toward her, not him. The shift was irreversible. The humiliated woman, now emboldened by the soldier's presence, lifted her chin and met the secretary's eyes for the first time that evening. The sight enraged him. Her defiance stung deeper than her silence ever had. "Sit down," he barked, but his command found no obedience. The woman did not move, and the soldier's steady hand on her shoulder cemented her stance. A murmur rippled through the hall, not of fear, but of recognition. They were witnessing a collapse, a titan undone not by force, but by dignity. The secretary reached for his glass again, as though the motion alone could reassert his dominance. But his hand trembled. The wine spilled, a crimson trail across the white tablecloth, a symbol too perfect to ignore. Whispers rose louder now, no longer suppressed. "He's lost it," someone muttered, and the word spread like fire. For years, his power had thrived on image, but tonight the image cracked, and through the crack poured truth. The soldier had exposed him without raising her voice, and the room knew it. Desperation overtook him. "Do you think anyone here will follow you?" He spat at the soldier. "You are nothing." His words, once enough to crush reputations, now rang with irony. She had said little, yet she commanded everything. He had shouted, and all he revealed was fear. She answered only with her gaze, steady and merciless, the kind that strips pretense away. In that silence, the truth became undeniable. He was no longer in control. The audience was no longer his. The donors and generals who once hung on his every word now watched with indifference, some even with disdain. Their survival instincts had shifted. They would not sink with him. Every second he fought against the inevitable only deepened his fall. The soldier's presence had made him irrelevant, and the woman's quiet dignity had made him small. The hall was no longer his kingdom. It was a witness stand, and he was the accused. His every move betrayed his guilt. Then came the final blow, not from the soldier's lips, but from the silence that followed her presence. When she placed a sealed file on the table before him, the sound of paper sliding across was louder than any shout. His face drained of color. He knew what it contained. The audience didn't need to see the contents. His reaction was enough. In that moment, his career, his image, his authority all unraveled before their eyes. The soldier hadn't destroyed him. He had destroyed himself, and she had merely held up the mirror. He sank back into his chair, deflated, the weight of his own downfall pressing harder than any enemy ever had. The soldier turned to the humiliated woman and offered her arm, guiding her away from the table with quiet dignity. Every eye followed them as they left the hall, leaving the secretary in ruins. His empire of arrogance had collapsed in the span of an evening, and the world had watched it happen. The soldier hadn't shouted, hadn't threatened, hadn't begged. She had simply spoken truth, and it had been enough. The banquet hall remained hushed long after the soldier and the humiliated woman stepped away from the table. The chandeliers still glowed, the silverware still gleamed, but the grandeur of the room had dimmed under the weight of what had just unfolded. The Secretary of Defense sat slumped, his authority stripped bare in front of the very people he once commanded with ease. No voice rose to defend him. No hand reached out in loyalty. For the first time in his reign, he was utterly alone. The soldier guided the woman toward the exit, her calm steps echoing across marble floors. There was no need for a triumphant speech or dramatic gesture. The silence that followed her was victory enough. The woman, who minutes earlier had felt invisible, now walked with her head high. Strength had returned to her posture, borrowed from the soldier who had dared to stand. Together, they left not as victims, but as victors of dignity. Their departure said more than any proclamation could. Behind them, the secretary tried to gather what little pride he had left. He muttered threats, half-formed words of vengeance, but no one listened. His voice no longer commanded the room. It barely carried beyond his chair. Those who once clung to his power now looked away, unwilling to be associated with failure. His empire, built on intimidation, collapsed not with battle, but with indifference. And in politics and war alike, indifference is deadlier than rebellion. The audience whispered, some in awe, others in shame for their silence earlier. They had seen arrogance burn and humility prevail, and the memory would not fade quickly. A donor leaned to another, shaking his head. It wasn't force, he whispered. It was presence. The soldier's defiance had reminded them all of something they had long forgotten. Real strength needs no arrogance to prove itself. That truth lingered like smoke, impossible to clear. As the doors closed behind the soldier and the woman, the hall seemed smaller, emptier. The secretary stared at the file still sitting before him, untouched but damning all the same. He didn't need to open it. His fear had already exposed its weight. He realized that he had not been defeated by the file, or even by the soldier's words. He had been defeated by his own reflection, shown clearly under the mirror she had held up to him. That realization would haunt him long after the hall emptied. Outside, the soldier finally released a quiet breath, her steady mask softening. The woman beside her touched her arm, whispering, "You didn't just defend me. You defended everyone who's ever been silenced." The soldier didn't respond, but the faintest curve of her lips betrayed the truth. She hadn't sought glory, only justice. And justice, when it arrives in silence, echoes louder than any applause. The night air felt different, freer, as they stepped away from the building. People who would witness the scene would tell the story in different ways, some whispering in secrecy, others recounting it with pride. But every version would end the same. The secretary mocked a woman, and a soldier's calm voice ended his reign of intimidation. That ending, unpolished and raw, would outlive the glitter of chandeliers and the pride of false authority. In the days that followed, the secretary's influence crumbled further. Whispers became headlines, and headlines became condemnation. His career dissolved in silence, the very weapon he had once wielded. Meanwhile, the soldier and the woman became symbols of resistance, of courage, of the quiet power that can change everything. Their story spread not as gossip, but as testimony. And in every retelling, the calm voice of the soldier silenced the roar of arrogance. Justice, that night, had not arrived with fanfare or spectacle. It had arrived quietly in 3 simple words: "She's with me." And in that quiet, the world saw something stronger than power. It saw truth. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories where dignity triumphs over arrogance. Leave a like and comment your thoughts. We read every one. And if you want to support this work even further, consider becoming a channel member. Together, we can bring more stories like this to light. More unforgettable revelations are on the way. Don't miss the next one.